Morning and good evening. My name is Atri. I'm the convener of this webinar. This is a webinar on the indigenous people and local communities uh, co-organized by the Campaign for Nature and also the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity. I think I will start. Welcome, everyone. Uh, this is quite a key meeting today because we are focusing on the role of the IPLC and how it relates to the ongoing negotiation of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, uh, which is due to start very soon. As you may be aware, the Campaign for Nature, which was launched about 2 years ago, believes that securing indigenous and community land tenure should be a central way to achieve the world's biodiversity objectives. The right-based approach to biodiversity conservation must also explicitly safeguard the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, ensuring a free, prior, and informed consent and alignment with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this webinar will provide a space for people in the ASEAN region to hear both global and regional perspective. This webinar will address some of the key questions that have been raised around IPLC and the Global Biodiversity Framework and comes in time. I hope to assist delegates and experts in considering of their position and language regarding the IPLC. So during this next hour or so, for 2 hours until 12 noon, some of the quick questions that we'd like to hear would be what's included in the 30 by 30 target? Experiences of IPLC land management and conservation, in particular in the ASEAN region, IPLC rights across the GBF, all those targets that have implications to the IPLC, and a few more. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted and proud and humbled to inform you we have been able to assemble a stellar slate of keynote speakers and panelists from around the world who are leaders in IPLC and also in ASEAN. I also would like at the outset thank the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity, led by its director, Professor Teresa Mundita Lim, who's help us undertake this webinar, which has been getting quite traction in the region. As you know, also the IPLC community is crucial in the 10 ASEAN member states. When we talk about the 30 by 30, one key issue that is always being raised within ASEAN is how would we fund it? And you may wish to know, I think many of you know, 10 days ago on the sideline of the UN General Assembly in New York, there was this very interesting pledge by the donors, 9 big donors, which pledge about $5 billion for protected areas. And I'm very glad also to know that the WIS Foundation, which is supporting the Campaign for Nature, is allocating some money for conservation. And I hope some of that would flow into ASEAN in the coming days and years. So with that, that is my opening remarks. I'd like to invite Professor Mundita Lim, but I was also made to understand she's traveling. She's making her way here. Can I get some guidance from Iqbal whether we are going to beam her pre-recorded message or has she arrived? Iqbal, do we have a pre-recorded message, Iqbal?
Here Wiratno, Director General of the Natural Resources and Ecosystems Conservation, Ministry of Environment and Forestry, Indonesia. The Honorable Loren Legarda, Deputy Speaker, House of Representatives, the Philippines. Professor Zachary Abdul Hamid, Chairman, Atri Advisory, Ambassador and Science Advisor, Campaign for Nature, and an ASEAN Biodiversity Hero. Kapak Conde Choque, Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. To our esteemed guests, representatives from the ASEAN member states, colleagues, and viewers. Thank you for joining us this morning as we discuss the crucial role of the indigenous peoples and local communities in the development and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Today, we will get to hear from our panelists on how we can all work collectively in achieving our biodiversity targets, and particularly on engaging with indigenous peoples and local communities towards expanding and diversifying national area-based biodiversity conservation and management systems. During my term as Director of the Biodiversity Management Bureau of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in the Philippines, one of my priorities was to harness the dedication and the unique expertise and knowledge of the indigenous peoples to complement our mandate in protecting the Philippines' biodiversity through the recognition of Indigenous Community Conserved Areas, or ICCAs. The ICCA concept is an attempt to encapsulate the richness of the linkages between indigenous peoples and local communities and a specific territory, a bond so strong that it shapes and cultivates their identity, culture, freedom, self-expression, and the way they govern their valuable resources. For example, indigenous groups collectively called Mangyan of Mount Iglit-Baco, a designated ASEAN Heritage Park, continue to use their original syllabary, which includes Faganoon Furahayo, to refer to their strict Forest Protection Zone or Sacred Ground or ICCA. These unique perspectives offer deeper insights into how we should be doing biodiversity conservation. The ASEAN region's natural wealth is inextricably linked to the people and communities that have nurtured and protected these resources for generations. In Southeast Asia, there are about 93 to 123 million people belonging to roughly 1,210 different ethnic groups residing in Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Indigenous peoples, through their traditional ecological knowledge, have developed a deep and intimate connection with biodiversity, understanding the importance of species and ecosystems not only in their daily survival, but as an essential part of their identity and culture. They are the keepers of centuries-old wisdom and practices that link social and ecological relationships and patterns. Thus, the role of indigenous peoples and local communities, or IPLCs, in the stewardship and protection of biodiversity and nature is beyond question. Their distinct connection with nature provides guidance on the use and protection of biological resources within their ancestral domains. As the world strives to halt biodiversity loss and recalibrate our bearings, the IPLCs have an essential role in the realization of our global biodiversity goals. At the third ASEAN Conference on Biodiversity, held last 5th of July 2021, His Excellency Deputy Secretary General of KETSA, Mr. Abdul Wahid, emphasized that the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework must be participatory, including the IPLCs, to meet the proposed goals and targets. This is aligned with the text in Proposed Target 21 in the Draft 1.0 of the Post-2020 GBF, which provides for equitable and effective participation in decision-making related to biodiversity by indigenous peoples and local communities. Guided by the mandate and directions from the ASEAN and the member states, the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity has been facilitating discussions and enhancing collaborations on how to best achieve our biodiversity targets through a whole-of-society approach. The aforementioned Third ASEAN Conference on Biodiversity served to facilitate thematic discussions where recommendations were consolidated and used as the basis for the ASEAN regional positions for the third meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. As the region collectively seeks solutions to address biodiversity loss and strives to expand the coverage of protected and conserved areas, discussions on other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, have also been ongoing. The ACB facilitated discussions among the AMS on how these OECMs may eventually be tapped to augment the existing protected areas in the region. These efforts are aimed at contributing towards the achievement of the global goal the parties to the CBD may eventually adopt at the upcoming COP15. I am confident that our illustrious panel and key representatives of ASEAN IPLCs will provide valuable insights on achieving our regional and global biodiversity targets while advancing the rights of biodiversity stewards. As I close, allow me to quote Mr. Peter Kalang, Chair of the ICCA Consortium, a Kenya from Sarawak, Malaysia, during one of the ACB 2020 virtual sessions. He said, and I quote, "The indigenous peoples and local communities play an outsized role in sustaining a healthy planet. This is because of their traditional skill, knowledge, and practices in caring for their lands. Supporting IPLC's rights is addressing biodiversity and the climate crisis." To Atri Advisory and Campaign for Nature, thank you for co-organizing this webinar with us today. Indeed, actions at all levels of society and from local to regional to international are essential in realizing our aspirations and rebuilding our relationship with nature. We are all part of the solution because #we are ASEAN Biodiversity. Thank you, and I wish all of us a productive meeting ahead.
Thank you, Professor. You're most welcome to join us if you have time when you arrive in the office. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to proceed to the next item on the agenda, and this is a keynote from Senator Lauren Legada, the Deputy Speaker, House of Representatives in the Philippines. She is a well-known figure. She's a politician, environmentalist, cultural worker, and a former journalist. Senator Legada will be speaking on the significance of IPLCs in conserving and protecting biodiversity in ASEAN. But ladies and gentlemen, I was informed that in the Philippines now, it's election time. So the senator have been going to the field campaigning, but she has always wanted to participate in our webinar. Uh, and today, I think she'll be delivering her keynote through a pre-recorded message. So, Iqbal, over to you.
My heartfelt greetings to everyone present here today. May I start by asking you to honor the people that first settled the lands you are currently occupying and the relationship they had with it. Our world and our culture have been so overrun with a paradigm of exploitation and dominance that we may be failing to grasp what it means to honor the land and to be part of it. As a lifelong learner, I find the lines in the Pocahontas song resonant, and I quote, "If you walk the footsteps of a stranger, you learn things you never knew, unquote. I've long fought for indigenous people's culture, but that culture, as we know, are deeply tied to the land. So I invite you to momentarily walk the footsteps of one Mateo Carino, who in the early 1900s tried to register land in then the municipality of Baguio, province of Benguet, that his ancestors had long occupied even before the Spanish colonization, but was denied that registration. The case was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court, the court of last resort during the American period. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes went so far as to say that, and I quote, "The acquisition of the Philippines was not like the settlement of the white race in the United States," unquote, to occupy the land. He claims it was to do justice to the natives, not to exploit their country for private gain, unquote. Holmes went on to say that it was hard to believe that inhabitants of Benguet would be excluded in the constitutional protection accorded to any person for his or her life, liberty, or property. The ruling was that if as far back as memory goes, the land has been held private, then it had to be so even before Spanish conquest and was never public land. It goes to reason, therefore, that owners of these lands did not need to ask for land from the state because it was never the state's land to begin with. They owned it even before there was a state. This decision, had it been implemented across the board, would have shaken the drafters of all property ownership in the country. It was not until the enactment of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in 1997 that this 1909 ruling saw a procedure for implementation. Fast forward present day, nearly 20% of lands are covered by ancestral title. Not coincidentally, these are the same parcels of land which we still find to be wild and natural, the natural capital on which a lot of our lives depend. At the same time, the highest incidence of poverty in the country are among those living in the uplands, the majority of whom are indigenous peoples. Up to 20% of the population mired in poverty is also a huge loss in our social capital. Our current society's failure to value the natural and the social capital in the uplands is why we are facing ecological collapse. Yet, we seem to have blinders as a society and are failing to change the way we manage these two types of capital. The Campaign for Nature is targeting the conservation of 30% of the globe by 2030. If we address the plight of our indigenous peoples and properly accord value to the ecosystems that provide aesthetic, ecological, and biodiversity services to the rest of us, we will already have hit the mother lode. Philippine experience in the implementation of the procedures for recognition of ancestral title under the IPRA law is replete with obstacles. But the main one is probably a mindset that persists about indigenous peoples, regarding them as minorities needing care, assistance, and yes, sometimes alms. What they in fact need is equal protection and the recognition by all of Philippine society. Not only do they deserve to live dignified lives in thriving cultures free from poverty, they need to secure their lands, which is the basis for those lives and cultures. This is the 1-2 punch that would deliver a double benefit of alleviating poverty and protecting our natural capital by honoring the traditions and knowledge of the poorest of the poor and ensuring their access to land and resources that were there since time immemorial. We will be on the right path towards a just transition. These are essential to delivering pandemic and climate change recovery that is inclusive, sustainable, and yes, resilient. Thank you. Isang lunti ang araw sa ating lahat.
Very much, Senator, for that inspiring keynote. Let me wish you all the best in your campaign. And for some of your officers who are participating with us, I encourage you to stay on until the end of this program. I'm referring to Ms. Georgie Carino, from the Forest Peoples Program and International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. As you may know, Georgie is an active campaigner and advocate over the past 35 years on indigenous peoples, human rights, community at the national and international levels. I know Georgie very well because both of us used to be members of Ban Ki-moon's Scientific Advisory Board several years ago. Georgie will be speaking on the IPLC and how it relates to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Georgie, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Esteemed colleagues, let me start by thanking the organizers of this meeting for allowing those of us in the region to engage in this important conversation. Today, I will be reflecting on IPLCs in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and it is gratifying that parties thus far in the negotiations are supporting the full inclusion of IPLCs in this forward-looking strategy. Why so? Let me start by making a few general observations about this critical juncture in the Earth and human history. Today's multiple crisis is deeply rooted in values that have become dominant in global economic, cultural, and political systems. These have prioritized economic growth over ecosystem resilience, modern scientific and technological innovations over context-specific knowledge and know-how, and centralized state interests over indigenous peoples and community rights. Therefore, it is enlightening to see that as humanity faces the existential threats of the Anthropocene, our institutions are starting to recognize that indigenous peoples and local communities have vital contributions to make in regard to conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and in the diverse ways of knowing and being in nature at this critical decade of safeguarding our planet and peoples. As stated by the UN, recent reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, stress the urgent need for transformative change to reverse impending ecological crisis. With only a limited window of time to bend the emissions curve, adapting to climate conditions, and halt the rapid loss of biodiversity, the values and wisdom of indigenous peoples can help societies achieve this transformation. So the current negotiations of a post-2020 biodiversity strategy offers a historic and I think not to be repeated opportunity for CBD parties, international organizations, scientists, business, civil society organizations, together with indigenous peoples and local communities, to be truly transformational across its goals, targets, and indicators. Goal A on conserving biodiversity needs to respect and protect the rights and vital contributions of IPLCs to biodiversity conservation by legally recognizing customary tenure rights over their lands and waters, the resource management systems, and their traditional knowledge. So IPLC territories must be appreciated as a distinct category of land use in spatial planning. Today, there is a great focus on protected areas and also area-based conservation or OECMs. However, historically, the designation of these territories have been as indigenous lands and waters. And unless we address this, we will not be able to address the conflicting laws and conflicts on the ground that have been widespread, actually, even in our region. So this time, with your indulgence, allow me to be more specific about existing laws and spatial planning. In the Philippines, conflicting laws which allow private concessions on IP's ancestral domain, the awarding of certificates of land for farmers, as well as national priorities for economic development, are actually undermining respect for ancestral domain and stopping indigenous peoples from controlling other interests on their lands. The IPRA, which was mentioned by Senator Loren, is being stripped of its essence with these conflicting laws. In Thailand, establishing special cultural zones recognizing intangible heritage of rotational farming of the Karen has been a great development, but this has not stopped the criminalization of rotational farming in many governments in Asia, despite this being a proven management which of mobile peoples moving across the landscape in order to conserve nutrients, as well as actually serving as a carbon bank. In Indonesia, the recent enactment of the Omnibus Bill, which rolls back around 80 other laws, will have impacts on the protection of indigenous peoples, while the bill on indigenous peoples has not yet been passed over 10 years. So again, this is an issue of conflicting laws. And in Malaysia, the National Human Rights Institute, Suhakam, held a national inquiry on land conflicts arising from national development plans and implementation of native customary rights. So actually, the issue we are discussing today, while very of a high cultural and philosophical level, is also very practical in terms of what can actually be changed. So I think the 30 by 30 spatial target under the new strategy will actually not be met unless IPLC territories are protected by law. The target needs to prioritize quality over quantity, underpinned by the evidence of that IPLC guardianship has been as good or even more effective in nurturing species abundance and genetic revitalization and ecosystem resilience, as proven by the fact that the most of biodiversity is today located in these territories. We have also been effective at stopping the expansion and worst ravages of industrial and agricultural expansion through defense of our homelands. And yet, many of our human rights and environmental defenders have been killed or are highly threatened. Going to sustainable use, the post-2020 GBF needs a dedicated target to promote customary sustainable use of IPLCs. This is contained in Article 10C of our convention. The COP has also approved a global plan of action on customary sustainable use. And this will be highly complementary to the mainstreaming of biodiversity values across all sectors of the society. So IPLCs are asking that this be given special attention in Target 9. On the use, harvesting, and trade of wild species, there are many national laws that criminalize hunting, fishing, and gathering by IPLCs of our traditional foods in the forests, while allowing commercial activities and even trophy hunting. Customary laws must be respected in this regard, including local ways of managing human and wildlife conflict. Oftentimes, the protection of wild species is given priority over local people. And because of this, IPLC should be primary beneficiaries from the use of biological resources, genetic resources, and even subsequent operations such as digital genetic sequencing information, which all have embedded traditional knowledge. So finally, looking at the human rights of IPLCs, which is presently mentioned as a right to equitable participation in decision-making, and also rights to lands, territories, and resources, which have been included in Target 21. This needs to be a cross-cutting target with specific mentions in other relevant targets. Let us learn lessons from the 2011 to 2020 biodiversity strategy, which included traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use, as well as government actions in Target 18. Assessment by the Global Biodiversity Outlook shows that only 10 to 15% of parties included IPLCs in their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Target 18 has not been met, and neither was Target 14 about addressing the needs of the most vulnerable in society. So whilst Target 18 was supposed to be cross-cutting, in fact, it was treated as one target and not chosen to be prioritized in many NBSAPs. So Target 20 on using the best available knowledge, including science and traditional knowledge, is highly needed and relevant. The biodiversity crisis needs the diverse knowledge and values across society to inform decision-making. Indigenous peoples and local communities have made a lot of progress on community-based monitoring and information systems, which is complementary to satellite data, global and national statistics, and scientific studies to provide a better understanding about the state of biodiversity and possible solutions. Parties are concerned or are problematizing the enrichment of their data for national reporting. But working together with communities can in fact bring out a lot of evidence that can be put in national reports. Now, finally, just to move towards closing, Asia has been characterized as a region of old peoples, but actually newer modern states. As mentioned, Asia is the region with the majority population of indigenous peoples in the world, as well as the greatest number of cultural and linguistic diversity. And Director Lim has actually highlighted these numbers in her presentation in ASEAN countries. All of these are great treasures moving forward. I'm so happy that Senator Loren Legarda referred to the landmark decision on native title won by my great-grandfather Mateo Carino, wherein what was declared as state land was in fact private land by native title. Today, as we envision our futures, let us follow this example by changing our thinking from thinking like a colonial state and living like its peoples. I thank you again for giving me this opportunity to address this important meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Georgie, for your very inspiring keynote, and also putting some personal context to it. The history mentioned by Senator Lagada, which has some blood relations to you. I'm so moved. Georgie, please stay on if you can. Maybe there's some questions in the later part of this webinar. You'll be most welcome to participate. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to move on to the next speaker on the agenda, and this would be Brian O'Donnell, the keeper of the flame of the Campaign for Nature. He is the director of the program. Brian will be talking to us on Target 3, the 30 by 30 IPLC rights and finance for IPLC. There are many exciting developments, in particular the last few days. I will invite Brian to elaborate on that. Brian, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Zachary. Can you hear me okay, everyone?
Loud and clear.
Great, thank you. Good morning there, good evening here. I am, as Zachary said, Brian O'Donnell, and I am the Director of Campaign for Nature. I'm joining you today from the ancestral and current lands of the Ute and Puebloan people in southwestern Colorado. I really appreciated Jogie's remarks and think that I would like to just agree with her remarks that unless the rights of indigenous peoples are recognized, that there is no chance that we meet the 30 by 30 goal. And that is in fact a centerpiece that we must achieve together to safeguard biodiversity, to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples, and to ensure that this COP15 is a success, as well as the Paris Climate Agreement is met. I think that it was also well said that the ASEAN region and Asia in general is a region of indigenous peoples. It's a mega biodiverse region. It's a mega diverse cultural region, and those things go hand in hand. As Dr. Zachary said, I'm with Campaign for Nature, and we have three overarching goals that we're trying to achieve. The first is protecting and conserving at least 30% of the world's ocean and seas by 2030. The second is to do it in a manner so that indigenous people's rights are advanced in achieving that goal. And then the third is to ensure that finance accompanies that goal so that we don't set up bold policy agreements that are never followed through on by donor governments and others who are implementing this. So a quick moment on why 30%. As many of you have seen, back in May 2019, the IPBES, a distinguished body of both scientists and leaders who are brought forward traditional ecological knowledge, a body that Dr. Zachary led before, reduced the global assessment, and it recommended that we have a transformational change to address biodiversity loss, recognizing that up to 1 million species are threatened with extinction, many within decades. It recommended that we expand protected and conserved areas and area-based targets, and it said we need that transformational change. It also noted that the two largest drivers currently of biodiversity loss are habitat, land degradation, primarily on land, and overexploitation in our seas. So if we're going to address that in a major way, we obviously have to deal with the consumption and economic patterns globally, but we also have to look at how we can ensure that land and oceans are conserved in a manner that maintains that habitat that species rely on for survival. As Joji recommended, many of the places that are intact because indigenous peoples have stewarded them for millennia. And so ensuring that they have the rights to their lands and territories is an essential pathway to achieve the 30 by 30 target. When we look at what's currently in the draft biodiversity framework, the current draft talks about protecting 30% of lands and oceans through a system of protected areas and other effective conservation measures. These other effective conservation measures have recently been defined and include private lands, could be former military bases that have outcomes, or other areas that are achieving biodiversity outcomes but may not be originally set aside for biodiversity. There is a role for protected areas, but we do know that protected areas have not always been just to indigenous peoples. In fact, many have strongly violated the rights of indigenous peoples, and that has to end and has to change radically, so that any protected areas would have to be established with free, prior, and informed consent, and benefit the local communities of which they are being supported by. The target currently talks about equitably managing protected areas and other effective conservation measures, but we've heard today and through the negotiations the desire for that language to include equitably governed as well, and that is an amendment to the text that we at Campaign for Nature support. That was recently included in the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Motion 101, which dealt with this 30 by 30 target and did recommend that these areas be equitably governed as well as equitably managed. We also have to make sure that the lessons in management approaches from indigenous peoples are part of the equation. This is a global goal, and it has to recognize that there are multiple different ways to protect and conserve nature, and that if we are to do it, we need to learn from the best practices, cultural practices, and approaches that will be different in different parts of the world. We also know that this is a global goal. So some nations are going to be able to protect a significant part of their land mass. We know in Canada, they're looking at large areas in the Arctic and the boreal forests, and they have quite a big land mass that they're interested in. Indigenous peoples are leading the way in the conservation advancements in recent years. But some countries have very little intact nature, but will still contribute to the goal in some way, but won't be able to meet that 30% target. So it's important to think of this as a global goal. Some countries being able to do more, some less, but together on this humanity together, we will all work to help meet this goal. We also know it's critical for the Paris Agreement that if we are to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, we need to protect at least 30% of the world's lands, especially those areas that are important for carbon. Those are forests, mangroves, grasslands. We see that those areas have a special importance for sequestering carbon. And if we are to lose that natural areas, it's impossible for us to remove the carbon from the air or to meet the Paris goals. So these things go hand in hand, our climate goals and our nature goals. But again, I want to stress how important the free, prior, and informed consent is to this. This cannot work and will not work unless it is done in full partnership with full respect for rights and advancing the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. They have been the most effective stewards of biodiversity and we've seen that by the areas that are intact. We've seen that in the recent studies that have shown the efficacy of indigenous territories in the Amazon and other regions that have had less deforestation than even protected areas. And I think Joji points out that we cannot have a system that criminalizes the defenders of nature that we've seen in recent years, or in recent decades, I should say. So at Campaign for Nature, we think this is really critical to align ourselves as close as we can with the goals that indigenous peoples have had. We've helped sponsor a number of global thematic dialogues in the CBD with indigenous peoples. We have worked to take some of the language recommendations that the IIFB, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, has put forward and incorporate those into our own comments. We have encouraged the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, which is a coalition of nations that support this 30 by 30 goal, to have direct consultations and dialogues with the IAFB and try to ensure that the 30 by 30 goal is done in an equitable manner, and we'll continue to do that all the way through the COP. So we welcome the advice and counsel and recommendations from Indigenous peoples, and any way that we can help advance this, that we want to stand shoulder to shoulder with you. We're also working on the finance component of this and recognize that finance has not reached the ground and has not helped benefit the local people. We think there's a few reasons for that. Structurally, the CBD talks about giving money from wealthier nations to developing nations. It doesn't talk about getting money down to peoples and communities. And so we have made a formal recommendation within the CBD process that new language be added to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that inserts the idea that Indigenous peoples and local communities are beneficiaries of payments for ecosystem services and official development assistance coming from wealthy nations as they implement this 30 by 30 target and other biodiversity targets. Second, the amount of money that has been proposed in the biodiversity framework is woefully inadequate. It currently only includes $10 billion a year from wealthy nations. And we know that wealthy nations, including my nation, are responsible for much of the biodiversity loss through our diets, our consumption patterns. You see this in Asia through the expansion of oil palm and other timber resources that are being exported for consumption in Europe or the United States or Canada or other places. So there's a responsibility to help address those impacts that wealthy nations are having. And we think it's at least 80 billion a year needs to be provided by wealthier nations in this effort, and make sure that local communities benefit. We also think there needs to be some other mechanisms that can help support Indigenous peoples and local communities management and securing of their territories. Currently, much of the money goes to NGOs and others, but not enough to Indigenous-led organizations. And so we are trying to change that by advocating with philanthropy and governments. You may have seen just a few days ago in New York during the UN General Assembly, there was a $5 billion pledge from foundations, primarily American foundations, but at least one British foundation, to support engagement of 30 by 30. And in that announcement, there was a clear indication that the leadership of Indigenous peoples and local communities would be a priority pathway to help achieve that, and to spend that money in manners that help support Indigenous-led conservation, which I think is a needed change and a needed reform that must happen. And finally, let me just end with a couple of personal experiences. I've been working in conservation now for several decades, starting by learning from the people of the Gwich'in people in the Arctic in their efforts to defend the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and an effort that continues to this day. And we're still fighting for that effort, and have learned that they have stewarded that region for millennia, and learned from them about their approach and how distinctly tied cultural conservation is with environmental conservation, that they are inseparable. You cannot separate the caribou of that area from the caribou people, as they call themselves. And more recently, in work on the Bears Ears National Monument here in Southwest Colorado during the Obama administration, with 5 tribes coming together to provide a new model for Indigenous-led conservation in the United States, one that I think has sparked massive change here and will be the future of conservation here. You have been far ahead of us of that in the ASEAN region with your leadership in protecting areas and showing governments how Indigenous peoples can lead the way. We can learn from you. Campaign for Nature can learn from you. We're excited to partner with you. We think that together, a conservation target that is rights-based, that is aligned with financing, is done in the right places, and is done in a manner that advances rights, can be essential to meet the biodiversity goals, to meet the climate goals. And so we're excited for this effort. We're excited to learn from people in the ASEAN region, and I'm grateful for all of you for participating in this webinar today. So thank you. Thank you, Zachary.
Thank you so much, Brian, for your overview of the challenges that we are facing today, and also providing a lot of hope for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the first segment of this webinar that is on the keynote presentation. I would suggest at this juncture, Iqbal, can you guide us? Let's take a picture of this meeting right now. Iqbal, guide us. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, I now would like to move to the panel discussion segment. We are also very fortunate to assemble today not only some colleagues at the global level, but some very interesting personalities in the ASEAN region who's working on the IPLC for quite some time. The panelists will be given about 5 to 7 minutes of time. Then I will let all the panelists do their presentation before opening the Q&A. I was made to understand there's quite a number of press people in the audience. I would urge them to record any questions that they have on the chat box, and we will attend to them as appropriate at the end of the presentation. Let me start by inviting Mr. Conde from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Mr. Conde, could I, yeah, there he is. He's now based in Colombia. A lot of experience in the IPLC. I was made to understand also Mr. Conde is on the Peoples and Biodiversity Unit of the CBD Secretariat. He is from Bolivia and a member of the Aymara tribe. He will give us an overview of the current draft post-2020 global biodiversity framework and the inclusion of the IPLC. So, Mr. Conde, you have the floor.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Yes, I see you can see it. Let me start by congratulate you for organizing this webinar, and thank you for the kind invitation to join it. Very briefly, the 14th meeting of the Conference of Parties adopted a comprehensive and participatory process to prepare the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The negotiations to develop the framework are being undertaken by a dedicated open-ended working group under the leadership of the co-chairs, Mr. Francis Oval from Uganda and Mr. Vasil Van Habre from Canada, and overseen by the Bureau of the Conference of Parties. The working group has met 3 times. The first meeting was in Nairobi, August in 2019. The second meeting was in Rome in February 2020. And the third meeting is divided in 2 parts. The first part took place online in August and September, and the second part is scheduled to take place from 12 to 28 January next year. And the COP15 is tasked to, the second part of COP15 is tasked to adopt the GBF next year. The previous version of the current first draft includes the zero draft, which was issued on January 6, 2020, and the update zero draft issued in 17th August. The first draft, it was issued in 12 July, and now it's available in, well, it's available in 6 official languages at the meeting's website. And the first report, the first part of the working group of the third meeting, it's also available. And along with this report, it's the reports of the contact groups where parties and observers had the opportunity to go section by section and target by target. The reports includes a composite text, which includes the proposal from parties and observers, whose texts were supported by parties during the session in one text, a composite text, and also includes a compilation of all the different text proposals made by parties and observers. These are the basis for the second part of the third meeting that is taking place in January. I won't go into details. The first draft, it has 11 sections, and section G has three. Section G has the target and is divided in three subsections: reducing threats to biodiversity, sections 1 to 8, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, targets 19 to 13, and the third subsection, tools and solutions for implementation and mainstream, target 13 to 21. Very briefly, a comment on section D, the theory of change. The framework is built around a theory of change, which is described here in this figure. The theory of change recognizes the urgent policy and action globally, regionally, and nationally that is required to transform the economic and social and financial models so that the trends that have exacerbate biodiversity loss will be established in the next 10 years and allow the recovery for nature ecosystem following the 20 years. So we can see that the theory exchange starts on the from the current status, loss of biodiversity, and moves to the right with all the elements to meet the vision, the 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature. Allow me to move on to these slides. And yeah, the participation of indigenous peoples in the post-2020 process. The process adopted by parties contains a set of principles to guide its implementation and organization of work, and a comprehensive consultation process, including global, regional, and thematic consultations. In addition, the COP14 also requests parties to facilitate and support the participation of indigenous people in the discussion process related to the framework. In response, the Secretariat, along the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, organized 3 global thematic dialogues for indigenous people and local communities on the framework. The first dialogue was held on 17 and 18 November in Montreal and reflected the results of the first meeting of the open-ended working group on the post-2020. The second dialogue was held virtually from 1 to 3 December 2020 and served as an opportunity for participants from indigenous peoples and local communities to reflect on the framework, including the updated Zero draft. The third global thematic dialogue with the support of Campaign of Nature was organized to provide an opportunity for IPLCs and representatives of parties and other governments to exchange views on the recent development of the framework, including the first draft. This was organized 2 weeks previous to the third meeting of the working group. The third meeting discussed 5 thematic issues, including traditional knowledge, target 20 of the first draft, customary sustainable use, target 14, 15, 9, and 10, contributions of indigenous peoples, lands, territories, and waters toward area-based conservation, target 1, 2, and 3, and equitable participation, target 21, and it had a remaining target with the dialogue addressed ABS, Global C, target 13, 8, and 17. The report of the proceeding, as well the outcome of the discussions, are available as an INF document for the working group of the third meeting. With that, I stop my presentation. I'm available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Conde. In fact, you can go on because a number of the panelists have been absent, but we'll come back to that. Ladies and gentlemen, I was informed Ms. Hen from Vietnam, Mr. Wiratno from Indonesia, and Mr. Shimre are not available at the current time. I will proceed with the speaker, the last speaker on the panel. And this is Miss Natasha Tanjuk, and this is Miss Natasha Tanjuko, who's replacing KM Reis, who is unavailable. Miss Natasha Ipal, can you beam Miss Tanjuko picture? Who's replacing KM Reis, who is unavailable. Miss Natasha Ipal, can you beam Miss Tanjuko picture? Has a very interesting background. She is a co-founder for Kids the Philippines at the age of 15 years old with a sister Bella. Natasha is still a student at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. She is eloquent champion for engaging youth in the 30 by 30 initiative. So without further ado, Natasha, you have the floor. Take your time. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zachary. And hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm Natasha Tanhutko. I am based in Manila. I'm in the Philippines. And I'm honored here today to speak on behalf of young people and how we can involve them in this amazing endeavor. So I will quickly share my screen. This idea of involving young people, I think, began for me at a very early age. I started 6 years ago when I was 15, together with my sister, who was only 13 at that time. And as young as 5 and 3, we were already exposed to the realities of the Philippines. We basically grew up understanding that we were in a place of privilege and that we needed to do something really to give back to our nation. And it was normal for us to really think this way. And when we got to school, we noticed that it wasn't for other children. And so we wanted to change the story. But where do we begin with young people? Today, I'll be showing you 3 simple steps on how exactly we can engage young people. And this is a formula we've quote unquote perfected. For the past 6 years, our organization has grown from a small group of 5, and now we're over 1,000 worldwide. And it's been amazing to hear all the different initiatives that young people have been coming up with all over the world. And we really believe that they truly are our greatest source of hope. So this is a quote by UN Secretary General that has inspired us really to truly believe that we can move forward with all the different things going on in our world, and that young people really are a great source of hope. But more than that, we are here for action. And so my main inspiration comes from really my grandfather, who taught us that we really had to love our country because it's the only one we have. So a lot of my advocacy really stems from cultural identity. And the reason for that is because I was really taught the amazing parts of being Filipino. So 6 years ago, a group of 5 kids, and we were a network of friends. Basically, we all had a common goal of wanting to give back to children. And successfully, we were able to do that through working with UNICEF. We raised enough to give back to 1,600 children. And this was an event planned solely by young people. At the age of 15, I didn't think it was possible, but because we had a lot of other people that believed in us too, this is what launched us into really, truly becoming a platform for change for the young people. So again, we basically just joined in what professionals were doing. We wanted to be a part of the conversation and be a part of that roundtable discussion where we could present ideas of the youth. And so we started really off doing simple outreach work. We'd go to different remote communities, we'd play games, we'd do things that would bring them hope and happiness. And we came up with this idea of really empowering the youth to power the nation. Similarly to how a lot of other young people are really advocating for community and camaraderie, we do the same, but we really stem from cultural identity. And so what we ended up doing to really learn how we could possibly connect partnerships of wisdom, or those that knew a lot, like professionals in the field and young people, of course, was really bringing them together through partnerships of collaboration. And one very successful example really was how we were able to connect our idea of working with our people and for our people, doing outreach work, typhoon relief. Because again, the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable to the climate crisis. Typhoon reliefs here happen yearly and are normal for us. Flooding is something that we see every day. And so really understanding our people was one main aspect we wanted to do, as well as understanding our planet and how these two things could come together and how young people could be in the front lines of change. So one great example was when we started an art festival called Kamalayan, which means awareness in Filipino. Me and my sister were exposed basically to the amazing crafts of the indigenous people in the Philippines. And we realized that majority of those who were living in Manila or in the capital weren't aware that there's so much more to the Philippines outside of the city. And so we wanted to create this fun way of engaging young people and to come up with this art festival wherein we were talking about indigenous culture and values and beliefs and really uplifting our local communities. And this began in 2016 when the conversation on climate wasn't something talked about normally. It was something that was very scientific. And so we wanted to break it down into promoting local artisans as well as local youth artists and seeing how they could have their own play on really what Filipino identity is. So we were able to rediscover what exactly our cultural identity is without really having to stuff it down people's throats. It was actually a very successful event because we got people to listen to Filipino music, to listen to indigenous sound, and without even having to explain what it was, but it was something natural. And so we also really learned that working with young people in a more formal setting, together with other young people, is quite different. We were able to get a room full of 200 young kids to sit down and listen to talks on marine biodiversity, when a lot of them wouldn't even want to sit through a 1-hour science class. So this is when we realized that there was really a gap in the system and how people were explaining things in school in the traditional system and how we were learning things outside, learning about our culture and all these different ideals that we weren't really taught in traditional school. So through Kids for Kids, we really grew this entire network of young people wanting the same, wanting to change the education system, wanting to advocate for children's rights, and seeing how we could talk about intersectionality through fun opportunities. So the first thing really in taking action with young people is we have to make things relatable. It's really important to make sure that the generation that you're talking to understands what's being talked about. And so definitely what we have grown so far, this entire community of almost 1,500 volunteers worldwide, we've crowdfunded over 20 million pesos for various communities. And we have an amazing network of over 250 organizations we've worked with over the past 6 years to really build this community for change and putting, again, our local communities at the front lines. And we realized throughout all of this is actually one amazing project we did together with UNICEF. This was right after Typhoon Yolanda, one of the strongest typhoons ever to hit recorded. We basically painted a youth hub together with typhoon survivors. These kids lost everything to the typhoon, and yet they really had a sense of hope. And so this is when we realized that change is holistic, and we aren't anymore just talking about whether it be access to education or just water, or just housing, or just all these small things around the right to play even, but it's really talking about how we can create that safe environment for children, how we have to go beyond just looking at them as actors later on in the future, but actors now. And that is why we realized growing up in an environment like this is actually a photo I took in one of our coastal cleanups, and this is already the after. So this was when everyone was leaving and that everyone was done cleaning up because it was just too much to take. So this is when I think I also had an awakening that the problems were so much closer than we thought, and that in order to really understand where this all came from, we have to explain our history. So exactly how we got there. So that's why if we're talking about 30 by 13, really how we can protect 30% of our land and seas, how can we go back really and explain how we got here to not protecting them? And so for us being in the Philippines, just an example, we definitely knew how to live with the land. We were actually very much aware of the way our land worked, and we lived with and for it. And what was saddening to see is that when all of a sudden we were colonized, there was this whole idea that we had to succumb to the ideals of the West, and we became driven by consumerism. And all of a sudden now, as we see in a lot of developing countries, it's very difficult for them to bounce back to what once was because of this idea that progress is always not where cultural identity is. And so that's why I think we have to look back again and really focus on Indigenous people. And I really like this quote. I came across it on Instagram and I completely forgot the source, but I just really like this saying about how Indigenous people are very scientific. It's just that their science includes the heart. And I definitely think this quote summarizes why our values must be placed in our Indigenous people. And so the third main point is really to allow young people to lead solutions and to give us a platform where we can show you how. So normally, young people are out on screens talking or even out doing climate strikes for inspiration. But actually what we're trying to do is show you that we're here for action. And so definitely our action has been going through this project. It's called Kapuluan ng Kabataan, which basically means Archipelago of the Youth, wherein we really want to connect generations back to our natural world. And this is exactly how young people can get involved with the 30 by 30 project, we think. Definitely this started with one project, and then now it's a collection of different projects that connect young people back to their natural world with a specific formula that stems from cultural identity. And so to explain, what we're trying to do is create safe spaces for young people in different parts of the Philippines. We're starting in two areas, one in an urban area, which is in Manila. We're converting a 2,500 square meter parking lot into an urban garden and safe space for children. And we're also working in a mangrove plantation community in Del Carmen and Siargao. So what we're trying to do is really use regeneration, talking about how it's not just about sustaining things anymore, but making sure things continue to keep having enough for our future, as well as through education and action. So it's not anymore just teaching, but accompanying it with avenues for action. And this is what young people today are hungry for, and what our education system traditionally normally can't give us within the four walls of a classroom. And so that's why we've really been trying to champion youth and community-funded green and blue spaces that allow our education to go outdoors and really into the ecosystem that we want to preserve. And so definitely with this project, it's been so amazing working with various partners, and we feel like this is exactly what other young people can do around the world. It's working with institutions or approaching even schools that have extra space and turning them into green areas. We've worked with Museo Pambata, which is this children's museum. We've converted a part of it into a bee farm. We involve the street kids in choosing what colors to paint. And really, it's all about education for local communities to inspire local stories. So for example, our work in Siargao, which is a protected island here in the Philippines, we were able to understand the protected area itself, as well as also understand other areas worth protecting. This region of the island is covered in hectares of mangroves, so 4,000 hectares of mangroves in one crucial area in the Philippines when it comes to wetlands. And so a lot of people don't know about this space, and what we want to do is really uplift their local stories. And so we're working together with the community itself in creating children's books and educational material that can be distributed as well to neighboring communities or even to other schools in the city to act as an example of what environmental conservation can be like. And so it's really also educating surrounding communities about the protected areas or areas worth protecting, because often these communities live with it every day. Sometimes they don't realize its value, and teaching them about this value will allow it to kind of have a chain reaction on the neighboring communities, and it becomes a very communal effort to protect these different areas. And so just to summarize everything, the whole idea really is to think global and act local, and understand really how we are definitely aware, but we need more action in putting these stewards, our Indigenous people, at the forefront through policy and through really understanding how we can create more avenues for their voices to be heard. And definitely with young people, we aren't here again just for inspiration, but for action. And so we really ask our leaders to do the same, to really realize how we are here to help you in the pursuit of all of these amazing endeavors. And to just summarize again the 3 points and how we can get young people involved in all of this is when we make things relatable, it's really talking about relatability, about protection at a local level. When we're talking about their history, we're talking about conservation at a cultural level. And so you're also informing young people what existed then and what can still exist if we protect it. And lastly, it's really giving young people a platform as well in spaces like this and in conversations where they can talk about how they want to be involved and can be involved. And so let's do it and really leave a legacy for our children. And that's, I think, how we can successfully, really, truly put together this 30 by 30 project with the youth involved in it. So thank you very much again for having me. On behalf of KM and Gab and the rest of our youth constituent, really excited to be a part of this campaign.
Thank you, Natasha, for your very eloquent presentation of the youth. You know, someone said this planet doesn't belong to us. My generation, I mean, we borrowed it from you. So we hope we can return it to you, your generation, in good condition. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We've come to the end of the panel discussion. We still have plenty of time. I have quite a number of questions that I want to field, not only to the panelists, but also to the keynote speakers who are still here today. I've also slated a comment, wanting a comment from Dr. Yong Yutavong. Dr. Yong Yu, are you in the audience? For concluding remarks, but given that we have some time and the webinar has been progressing very engrossingly, Dr. Yong Yu, who is a former Deputy Prime Minister of Thailand and also a scientist by training. He is still very active, a key member of the Global Steering Committee of the 30 by 30 in ASEAN. Dr. Yong, would you like to take the floor now or later?
Sure, I can take it now, but
yes,
I can stay on.
And then you can take as much time, sir. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sakri, Professor Mundita Lim, Brian O'Donnell, distinguished keynote speakers, panelists. It gives me great pleasure to say some concluding remarks on the occasion of today's webinar on the role of indigenous people and local communities. This webinar draws together a group of concerned people about biodiversity and the role of indigenous people and local communities. We have seen how these subjects are intertwined in examples, especially from the ASEAN region. Thanks to Teresa Mundita Lim, Senator Lauren Legarda, and Georgie Carino for going over the background status of the indigenous people and local communities in our countries and relation to biodiversity conservation. Thanks to Brian O'Donnell, the Director of Campaign for Nature, for going over the global status of this subject, especially in relation to the 30 by 30 campaign to conserve at least 30% of forests and the seas by 2030, and the role of high-income countries in supporting indigenous people and local communities in conserving biodiversity. Thanks to the panelists, we have learned from Mr. Conde from Colombia about the Global Biodiversity Framework document under preparation and the views of the young people. I really enjoy the talk by Natasha Tanjatko, and we'll remember her crying, empower the youth to power the nations, should be a loud call to the world. 3 years ago, the Authoritative Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, told us that 1 million species of our plants and animals are under threat of extinction, or 60% of our ecosystem services. The services that provide us with our food, water, and clean air are degraded due to human activities. I also checked other sources of information. They come together in pointing out in the same direction that we are heading towards a big extinction event, perhaps the largest since the dawn of the humankind, due to global warming and encroachment on forests, lands, and the seas. So we have a big problem on our hand. Nature is in crisis, and it is made worse today with the pandemic, which hopefully will pass, but the effect will linger. Indeed, the pandemic may well be linked to species losses and now encroachment on wildlife. But as we have heard from our keynote speakers and panelists today, the indigenous people and local communities may well be our good friends to help stop the deterioration. And vice versa, by the way, safeguarding and restoring ecosystem resilience will also be critical to support their well-being. Indigenous people are custodians of some of the most biologically diverse territories in the world. Their traditional knowledge has been and continues to be an invaluable resource that benefits all of our humankind. Although they make up only 6% of the global population, indigenous people inhabit 85% of areas proposed for biodiversity conservation worldwide. The cultures and lifestyles of the indigenous people and local communities are inextricably linked to biodiversity and their community. So they have been very effective in preventing habitat loss and often more effective than traditional conservation methods. The rich discussion that took place today convinced me on the role of the indigenous people and local communities, and in particular, those in our midst in the ASEAN region. It is therefore only right and fair that the international community, now actively negotiating the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, recognizes the rightful place of the indigenous people and local communities. Needless to say, we need to be in touch with the indigenous people and local communities to learn from their ways of life and also to warn them about future consequences of some of the practices which may not be ecologically friendly. So we have to learn from one another and teach one another. Like us, the indigenous people and local communities also need to learn and modify the ways of life to be in harmony with nature. Last but not least, let me once again thank the participants of this webinar, including the audience who have contributed their time and effort to make it a roaring success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. As I also said, we are not done yet. We still have time until 12, and we have a few questions here. The first question is to Georgie. Georgie, you related to us some of the stories in the yet. We still have time until 12, and we have a few questions here. The first question is to Georgie. Georgie, you related to us some of the stories in the ASEAN member states where governments seem to be committed, but eventually they did not, and I'm sure with your many decades of experience, you must be very frustrated. Question is to Georgie. Georgie, you related to us some of the stories in the ASEAN member states where governments seem to be committed, but eventually they did not, and I'm sure with your many decades of experience, you must be very frustrated, just like me. Can you tell us a bit how do we get out of this so-called imbroglio, Georgie?
Yes, thank you. I think we started the discussion today by saying that we need to get out of old habits of thinking. Unfortunately, governments in the pursuit of economic development and modernization have thought of indigenous peoples as backward, and that we actually need to change our ways and be brought into modern society. But we have seen that that approach has actually of diminishing or not really valuing what indigenous peoples bring, have actually led to our impoverishment when we try to be incorporated as the poorest in modern society. But if we change our thinking to look at the values of nature and culture as very critical, then we are able to see the great contributions that indigenous peoples are able to bring, not just for improving our well-being, but for all of society. And I'm actually happy that despite the crisis or because of the crisis, our old ways of thinking and the requirement to transform our systems as well as our values and our personal habits is leading us to reevaluating and understanding what it is that we really value. Because if we continue in our current ways, so-called business as usual, it is clear that it is the road to ruin of a lot of the world itself, but also of things that we actually hold dear. We hold our family dear, we hold our communities dear, we hold our identities. So let us pay attention to these so-called intangibles of values, but which will actually guide us to our path towards the future.
Thank you, Georgie. Very informative indeed. I have a question for Mr. Conde here. Someone mentioned just now that in the biodiversity run-up to 2011-2020, I think it's the IG target, only 10 to 15% of parties include the IPLC in their strategies. Can you tell us, is there any reason for that, Mr. Conde? Pardon? Oh, he has left. That's all right then. Let me proceed to another question. This is for Brian, really. You make a very convincing argument on the link between 3030 and the IPLC. And also with George's comment that eventually the 30 by 30 initiative is not going to achieve its goal without the full participation of the IPLC. That is one aspect I want you to elaborate. How could ASEAN member states be more sympathetic to that link? I have another question, it's a very interesting question too, and this is about funding, the recent development that was announced in New York. And how could the ASEAN member states eventually use the prospect of some of those financing to undertake some really practical projects in the region? So Brian, are you still there?
I am still here, yes. So maybe I'll take that first question on the key role. If you look at the world's concentration of biodiversity, and you look at another map overlaying the lands that are claimed by indigenous peoples, some of which they have full rights for, some of which need to be rights still need to be adjudicated and given to indigenous peoples over their ancestral and current territories. But there's an almost direct overlap where those places are. Most of the world's concentration of critical biodiversity is on lands that is stewarded by indigenous peoples. And so their leadership, their approaches have to be central to achieving this target. The key way that countries need to do this is after the first step is to ensure that the target itself is got language for free, prior, and informed consent, that it ensures that equitable governance is a key component of the 30 by 30 target. The second part then is that if this target is agreed to in Kunming, China, at the end of the Conference of Parties in the spring of 2022, then each country develops what they call a national biodiversity strategy and action plan. Those plans are the times when countries will decide how they will implement the global biodiversity framework in each of their countries. It's essential then at that outset that they start to have a dialogue with indigenous peoples, that they hear directly from indigenous peoples as to what their desires are for their territories. Do they want to see lands included in this target? Do they not want to? And to respect those rights and wishes, and to see them as the drivers of this agenda. In the past, it had been done by governments or NGOs without full participation from indigenous people. So that national biodiversity strategic action plans are a critical component where both the rights must be addressed, but also the desires and leadership must be respected, and the approaches. So I think it's also important for indigenous peoples to start to think about that now. How will they engage in this? How do they want to be engaged? Do they need additional resources to be engaged, and in what way? This can be looked at either as a threat to indigenous lands or as an opportunity for indigenous titling and land tenure. So thinking about both, what are the things indigenous peoples are worried about in this strategy? What are the things they're excited about? And how do we make sure that those desires are advanced in those biodiversity plans? Moving to the funding question that you asked, that's an important one. You know, there's a structural barriers, I think, that you see in a lot of funding that comes from foundations and from governments, that it can be very difficult to access those funds because it can be a bureaucratic process. It could require a lot of paperwork. You can have language barriers. You can have other issues. Many of the foundations in the United States require audited financial statements from grantees to comply with federal laws. So there's things like that can make it difficult for small community organizations. So I think we do need to find a way for those foundations to better understand that to be successful, these grants can't just go in big efforts to Western NGOs. They need to think about how they can deliver these resources in a way that gets to the ground, to those frontline defenders. And that means changing some of their approaches, some of their grant-making priorities, some of their reporting priorities, which I think there's some openness to do. Each of these foundations that announce a pledge is different. They have different boards of directors, and so you'll see it. Some may be very enthused and open to do that right away. Some may be slower, but I do think that the ASEAN region, with its critical importance for biodiversity, has to be one of the priority regions. And I've heard from the Bezos Earth Fund that they're looking at that region, and I think they announced quite a large sum of resources. So I would say it's important for indigenous peoples to contact them with proposals for what they want to do, how they would spend the money. I think they also like partnerships. So going in, they only have a half dozen or so staff. So you can imagine the number of proposals coming in. But I think teaming up with a number of other indigenous organizations and entities in a regional basis or others can be another approach that will help to navigate that. So you can raise your voice with a collective proposal would be an idea that I would recommend.
Thank you, Brian. In fact, the last segment of your response answers to the question by Nosrat in the chat. How could communities take the initiative to write proposal? Nosrat, I think it has been answered by Brian. But I want to go back to the issue, Brian. One of my concerns in ASEAN, and I intend to work closely with the Global Steering Committee of the 30 by 30. Present today is Dr. Yong Youth, also Mr. Emil Salim of Indonesia, and Tony Lavina and Senator Lagada. How do we mobilize the political leadership in the region. To start with, to be members of the High Ambition Coalition, which is co-chaired by Costa Rica, France, and the UK. For now, only Cambodia in ASEAN is a member of the HEC. If you ask me, I'd like to see the whole 10 member states being members of the HEC. But this can only come about by the political will, political understanding of the leaders. There's senior officials, of course. There's still roadblocks. One of that is this controversy between conservation and development, of which we are trying to work to do some research to highlight that these two can synergize one another. I wonder, with your help at the CFN, we can develop a small position paper which would encourage ASEAN to join the HAC. And one way of that, they kept saying, show me the money, where's the funding, you know? Now with the recent announcement, there's a golden chance for us to reset the engagement that we have with ASEAN. And I hope also ASEAN would regard the CFN as a partner in this exercise. Is not only telling us what we need to do, but also coming up with the practical steps, including some financial resources, which can be mobilized to this region. I kept saying that ASEAN itself has a proud history of conservation. Georgie, you remember the Heart of Borneo project, you know, launched in 2007, and the Coral Triangle Initiative launched. These are two international collaboration that ASEAN has done before. So to me, this 30 by 30 is one of the extension, a bigger, ambitious one that we should look in and try how we could engage them. Maybe Dr. Young Youth, you want to have a comment right over here? Dr. Young Youth?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you are touching on a very important subject, because although ASEAN is rich in biodiversity and also have a lot of indigenous people, in fact, the south of Thailand, you know, bordering Malaysia, we also have, you know, quite a lot of indigenous people, and everywhere in the country. So this should be an issue of importance to ASEAN and to Thailand. And the 30 by 30 campaign, I think, should perhaps try to draw in Thailand. Yeah, I have tried to contact officials who said that they are still not clear, you know, and they want to wait until, you know, the COP, you know, and so on. But I think that there should be some kind of conversation between these three countries, you know, Costa Rica, France, and UK, and officials in Thailand. And I think the officials in Thailand whom I have approached are open to that. Maybe some kind of a call to straighten understanding, because I don't think that the Thai officials quite realize what this is about, you know. So it is something that needs further work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Youngyut. Georgie, are you still there? Do you have any comments on this particular issue, Georgie?
Yes, indeed. You have mentioned already the Coral Triangle and the Heritage Park initiatives, which are important. But these have been still very much state-led, which is good because that provides the enabling framework. But I think what needs to happen in the future is having partnerships with communities, because I think increasingly, including HAC, but also this fund for nature, are really looking that there should be collaboration with an enabling framework of governments, as well as really directly having dialogue and partnerships with the communities. And I think this is very good for our uh, political structures in our own region and the opening up of greater collaboration. You asked earlier about why only 10 to 15% have included indigenous peoples in the NBSAPs. In the past, and even in the future, I think, governments are completely given the freedom to choose their priorities of what to put in their NBSAP. However, there is an attempt now in the negotiation of the post-2020 that we see that our ambition can be raised collectively to really be able to meet those targets. And included in that negotiation is what will be some of the, what they're calling headline indicators, where we will all be measured as to how well we are doing. So for example, the targets on conservation, each party will have to say how much they progressed and are they working with indigenous peoples to meet this target. In the same way, are they including customary sustainable use in their NBSAPs, or are they reforming or initiating new laws in order to create this enabling framework? So I think there is now a move to say that, yes, we will still work within national context and priorities, but our overall ambition has to be really high, and all of us have to show that we're actually transforming. Yeah, that's what I can add.
Thank you very much, Georgie. I want to move. Natasha, we haven't forgotten about you. There's a question here to you, Natasha. How can youth in the region be more involved? What were some of the challenges that you have faced on the ground to raise awareness? You know, Natasha, about 1 month ago, I was involved with a group of youth. You are one of them with KM Brace on this town hall meeting on the 30 by 30 in the Philippines. I was really mesmerized by the level of interest, awareness, and commitment of the youth. And I brought this news to some friends in Malaysia who are also very keen to do what the youth in the Philippines have done. You have any comments to that earlier part of my question? How can youth in the region be more involved?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question. I definitely think one way to get young people involved is really it coming from other young people. So that's the reason why with our approach for our involvement in 30 by 30, me together with KM and Gab Mejia, what we really want to do is take it really to the regional level where we can really activate other young people as well. And it makes it easier from it coming from other young people like us. So I feel like that's one thing that we've really noticed is when it's other young people calling other young people to come and join, it makes it even more exciting. So that's one approach that we really want to take after really pursuing the Philippines and hopefully joining the High Ambition Coalition, that we really take it further up a notch to the regional level so that we're really able to have conversations with international youth to really see what they're also doing on ground. On top of this, I'm also part of GAB as well as part of this group called Youthtopia, which was founded by Melati Wysen of Bye Bye Plastic Bags, and it's actually a coalition of young people all around the world. And so we definitely have that network already existing. It's really just finding a way to effectively tap them to do the same in their own nations, to lobby and to really find ways into talking to these people at higher levels and how we can move forward with the bill. I feel like the most difficult part is that, like, understanding exactly the processes in different nations and how to do it. I know here in the Philippines, we do have forms of really lobbying in person and things of the sort. But with the pandemic, it's been quite difficult. So that's why opportunities like the town hall have really helped us really gather into one room different stakeholders and actually really understand what they're already doing on ground. So definitely working with grassroots communities has been one amazing experience I've had the opportunity to do. The past year in Siargao, we worked together with the municipality of Del Carmen, and so really understanding what exactly the locals are looking for. They are trying to, the island is protected. However, again, there are a lot of rules that aren't being followed because they aren't understood. So it's figuring out how to translate this again at the local level. So with the previous people really talking about how we can get funding to these local communities and directly to in these areas would be of really great help. And through Kids for Kids, like our organization, that's what we really hope to do, is get all these different amazing opportunities to the ground, really, because this is where the action's happening. So definitely with getting other youth involved, it's those steps that are available to us. And through also an informational campaign that we hopefully will be launching this October. We actually just met with the Campaign for Nature a few days ago with Mr. Brian, and we're really excited to roll out this campaign through online sources and later on the ground.
Thank you, Natasha. We are nearing the end of our discussion. Can I invite anyone to represent Executive Director Mundita Lim to give any comments at all? Oh, there you are. Teresa,
Hi,
welcome.
yes, sir.
Yeah, it's great to see you.
Yes, good morning. Yes, yeah.
Go ahead. Any comments from you?
This is the only time I was out, but I'm glad I was able to catch the meeting at least towards the end, this forum, and I appreciate very much the discussions, and we're looking forward on the contributions of the indigenous peoples and local communities in meeting the globally agreed targets. If we are only to be able to consider their contributions, then then it becomes realistic to look forward to a target that will be 30 by 30 would be a more realistic target. I think the important call for all of the ASEAN member states is we need to have a realistic target, and of course that means financing should be made available, and the achievement should be participatory. And when we talk about participatory, we are looking at the support that the government should be able to receive from the other stakeholders, and that includes, of course, the youth that Natasha was speaking of, the contributions of the indigenous peoples and local communities, of subnational governments, and I think that's a very important call that everyone can make, so that the 30 by 30 becomes more achievable and more realistic. So we're very glad to be able to partner with Atri. I'm very honored to always join you in fora. Professor Zachary, an ASEAN Biodiversity hero. It's always enriching to be able to listen to these conversations and provide what the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity provide, the support that we can provide to to have an active discussion and an important discourse, so that the ASEAN member states and the stakeholders can better make informed decisions towards the upcoming discussions on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So we're always pleased to join you in the discussions, and thank you very much for allowing us to do that, Professor Zachary.
Thank you, Professor, for your inspiring words, encouraging words. As I mentioned earlier, I would like to work closely with the Global Steering Committee members. In this meeting is Dr. Yong Youth and Brian with the CFN. I hope there's a way forward out of this webinar, and that is for us to develop a proposal to the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity, how this 30 by 30 could be of assistance to realize the empowerment of the IPLC in our ASEAN member states. I hope we can do that, Brian, yeah, in the weeks to come. But just to conclude, I have had nearly 40 years of experience on the global level. I'm one of the original negotiators of the CBD in my younger days. Georgie knows that. But I am also, I love the region. I'm a member of ASEAN. And somehow I wanted to have ASEAN to be part of the global development, you know. So today's webinar, I think, has been inspiring for me, and I hope for others too. And we look forward that ASEAN could also be one of the leaders in biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. So with that, thank you again, Teresa and others. Thank you so much. Have a good weekend, and also stay safe. Without that, meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zachary. Thank you all.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.